Welcome to another episode. Sigmund Freud's Moses and Monotheism. Section 1. 1. The historical premises. The historical background of the events which have aroused our interest is as follows. Through the conquest of the 18th dynasty, Egypt had become a world empire. The new imperialism was reflected in the development of certain religious ideas, if not in those of the whole people, yet in those of the governing and intellectually active upper stratum. Under the influence of the priests of the sun god, Aton Heliopolis, possibly strengthened by suggestions from Asia, there arose the idea of a universal god, Aten, no longer restricted to one people and one country. With the young Amenhotep IV, who later changed his name to Akhenaton, a pharaoh succeeded to the throne who knew no higher interest than in developing the idea of such a god. He raised the Aten religion to the official religion, and thereby the universal god became the only god. All that was said of the other gods became deceit and guile. With a superb implacability, he resisted all the temptations of magical thought and discarded the illusion, dear particularly to the Egyptians, of a life after death, with an astonishing premonition of later scientific knowledge. He recognized in the energy of the sun's radiation the source of all life on earth, and worshipped the sun as the symbol of his God's power. He glorified in his joy in the creation and in his life in Ma'at, truth and justice. It is the first case in the history of mankind, and perhaps the purest of a monotheistic religion. A deeper knowledge of the historical and psychological conditions of its origin would be of inestimable value. Care was taken, however, that not much information concerning the Aten religion should come down to us. Already under the reign of Akhenaton's weak successors, everything he had created broke down. The priesthood he had suppressed vented their fury on his memory. The Aten religion was abolished. The capital of the heretic pharaoh demolished and pillaged. In 1350 BC, the 18th dynasty was extinguished after an interval of anarchy. The general Harmhab, who reigned until 1315, restored order. Akhenaton's reforms seemed to be but an episode, doomed to be forgotten. This is what has been established historically, and at this point, our work of hypothesis begins. Among the intimates of Akhenaton was a man who was perhaps called Tuhutmos, as so many others were at that time. The name does not matter, but its second part must have been Mose. He held high rank and was convinced adherent of the Aten religion, but in contradistinction to the brooding king, he was forceful and passionate. For this man, the death of Akhenaton and the abolition of his religion meant the end of all his hopes. Only proscribed or recanting, could he remain in Egypt. If he were governor of a border province, he might well have come into touch with a certain Semitic tribe, which had immigrated several generations ago. In his disappointment and loneliness, he turned to those strangers and sought in them for a compensation of what he had lost. He chose them for his people and tried to realize his own ideals through them. After he had left Egypt with them, accompanied by his immediate followers, he followed them by the custom of circumcision, gave them laws, and introduced them to the Aten religion, which the Egyptians had just discarded. Perhaps the rules the man Moses imposed on his Jews were even harder than those of his master and teacher Akhenaton. Perhaps he also relinquished the connection with the sun god of On, to whom the latter had still adhered. For the exodus from Egypt, we must fix the time of the interregnum after 1350. The subsequent periods of time until possession was taken of the land of Canaan are especially obscure. Out of the darkness which the biblical text has here left, or rather created, the historical research of our days can distinguish two facts. The first, discovered by E. Sellon, is that the Jews, who even according to the Bible, were stubborn and unruly towards their lawgiver and leader, rebelled at last, killed him, and threw off the imposed Aten religion, as the Egyptians had done before them. The second fact, proved by E. Meyer, is that these Jews on their return from Egypt united with tribes nearly related to them in the country bordering on Palestine, the Sinai Peninsula, and Arabia, and that there, in a fertile spot called Kadesh, they accepted under the influence of the Arabian Midianites a new religion, the worship of the volcano god Jahwe. Soon after this, they were ready to conquer Canaan. The relationship in time of these two events to each other and to the Exodus is very uncertain. The next historical allusion is given in a stele of the Pharaoh Merenptah, who reigned until 1215, which numbers Israel among the vanquished in his conquests in Syria and Palestine. If we take the date of this stele as a terminus ad quem means the point at which something ends or finishes. There remains for the whole course of events, starting from the Exodus about a century after 1350 until before 1215. It is possible, however, that the name Israel does not yet refer to the tribes whose fate we are here following, and that in reality we have a longer period at our disposal. The settling of the later Jewish people in Canaan was certainly not a swiftly achieved conquest. It was rather a series of successive struggles and must have stretched over a longish period. If we discard the restriction imposed by Merenptah, still, we may more readily assume 30 years a generation, as the time of Moses, and 2 generations, at least, probably more, until the union in Kadesh took place. The interval between Kadesh and the setting out for Canaan need not have been long. Jewish tradition had, as I have shown in my last essay, good reason to shorten the interval between the Exodus and the foundation of our religion in Kadesh. Our argument would incline us to favor the contrary. Till now, we have been concerned with the external aspects of the story, with an attempt to fill in the gaps of our historical knowledge, in part a repetition of my second essay. Our interest follows the faith of Moses and his doctrines, to which the revolt of the Jews only apparently put an end. From the Javist account written down about 1000 BC, though doubtless founded on earlier material, we have learned that the union of the tribes and foundation of our religion in Kadesh represented a compromise, the 2 parts of which are still easily distinguishable. One partner was concerned only in denying the recency and foreignness of the god Yahweh, and in heightening his claim to the people's devotion. The other partner would not renounce memories so dear to him of the liberation from Egypt and the magnificent figure of his leader Moses, and indeed he succeeded in finding a place for the fact as well as for the man in the new representation of Jewish early history, in retaining at least the outer sign of the Moses religion, namely circumcision, and in insisting on certain restrictions in the use of the new divine name. I have said that the people who insisted on those demands were the descendants of the Moses followers, the Levites, separated by a few generations only from the actual contemporaries and compatriots of Moses, and attached to his memory by a tradition still green. The poetically elaborated accounts attributed to the Javist and to his later competitor, the Elohist, are like gravestones under which the truth about those early matters, the nature of the Mosaic religion and the violent removal of the great man, truths withdrawn from the knowledge of later generations, should, to speak, be laid to eternal rest. And if we have divined aright the course of events, there is nothing mysterious about them. It might very well, however, have been the definite end of the Moses episode in the history of the Jewish people. The remarkable thing about it is that this was not so, that the most important effects of that experience should appear much later and should, in the course of many centuries, gradually force their way to expression. It is not likely that Yahweh was very different in character from the gods of the neighboring peoples and tribes. He wrestled with the other gods. It is true, just as the tribes fought among themselves, yet we may assume that a Yahweh worshipper of that time would never have dreamt of doubting the existence of the gods of Canaan, Moab, Amalek, and so on, any more than he would the existence of the people who believed in them. The monotheistic idea, which had blazed up in Akhenaton's time, was again obscured and was to remain in darkness for a long time to come. On the island Elephantine, close to the First Nile cataract, discoveries have yielded the astonishing information that a Jewish military colony settled there centuries ago, worshipped in their temples beside their chief god, Jehu, two female deities, one of whom was called Anat Jehu. Those Jews, it is true, had been separated from the mother country and had not gone through the same religious development. The Persian government in the 5th century BC communicated to them the new ceremonial regulations of Jerusalem. Returning to earlier times, we may surely say that Yahweh was quite unlike the Mosaic God. Aten had been a pacifist, like his deputy on earth, or rather his model, the Pharaoh Akhenaton, who looked on with folded arms as the empire his ancestors had won fell to pieces. For a people that was preparing to conquer new lands by violence, Yahweh was certainly better suited. Moreover, what was worthy of honor in the Mosaic God was beyond the comprehension of a primitive people. I have already mentioned, and in this I am supported by the opinion of other workers, that the central fact of the development of Jewish religion was this: in the course of time, Yahweh lost his own character and became more and more like the old God of Moses, Aten. Differences remained, it is true, and at first sight they would seem important, yet they are easy to explain. Aten had begun his reign in Egypt in a happy period of security, and even when the empire began to shake in its foundations, his followers had been able to turn away from worldly matters and to continue praising and enjoying his creations. To the Jewish people, fate dealt with series of severe trials and painful experiences, so their God became hard, relentless, and, as it were, wrapped in gloom. He retained the character of an universal God who reigned over all lands and peoples. The fact, however, that his worship had passed from the Egyptians to the Jews found its expression in the added doctrine that the Jews were his chosen people, whose special obligations would in the end find their special reward. It might not have been easy for that people to reconcile their belief in their being referred to all others by an all-powerful God with the dire experiences of their sad fate. But they did not let doubts assail them. They increased their own feelings of guilt to silence their mistrust, and perhaps in the end they referred to God's unfathomable will, in quotation marks, as religious people to this day. If there was wonder that he allowed ever new tyrants to come who subjected and ill-treated his people the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, yet his power was recognized. All those wicked enemies got defeated in their turn, and their empires destroyed. In three important points, the later Jewish God became identical with the old Mosaic God. The first and decisive point is that he was really recognized as the only God, beside whom another God was unthinkable. Akhenaton's monotheism was taken seriously by an entire people. Indeed, this people clung to it to such an extent that it became the principal content of their intellectual life and displaced all other interests. The people and the priesthood, now the dominating part of it, were unanimous on that point. But the priests, in confining their activities to elaborating the ceremonial for his worship, found themselves in opposition to strong tendencies within the people, which endeavored to revive two other doctrines of Moses about his God. The prophet's voice untiringly proclaimed that God disdained ceremonial and sacrifice and asked nothing but a belief in him and a life in truth and justice. When they praised the simplicity and holiness of their life in the desert, they surely stood under the influence of Mosaic ideals. It is time now to raise the question whether there is any need at all to invoke Moses' influence on the final shape of the Jewish idea of their God, whether it is not enough to assume a spontaneous development to a higher spirituality during a cultural life extending over many centuries. On this possible explanation, which would put an end to all our guessing, I would make two comments. First, that it does not explain anything. The same conditions did not lead to monotheism with the Greek people, who were surely most gifted, but to a breaking up of polytheistic religion and to the beginning of philosophical thought. In Egypt, monotheism had grown, as far as we understand its growth, as an ancillary effect of imperialism. God was the reflection of a pharaoh autocratically governing a great world empire. With the Jews, the political conditions were most unfavorable for a development away from the idea of an exclusive national God towards that of an universal ruler of the world. Whence then did this tiny and impotent nation derive the audacity to pass themselves off for the favored child of the sovereign Lord? The question of the origin of monotheism among the Jews would thus remain unanswered, or else one would have to be content with the current answer that it was the expression of their particular religious genius. We know that genius is incomprehensible and unaccountable, and it should therefore not be called upon as an explanation until every other solution has failed. Furthermore, there is the fact that Jewish records and history themselves show us the way by stating emphatically, and this time without contradicting themselves, that the idea of an only God was given to the people by Moses. If there is an objection to the trustworthiness of this statement, it is that the priests, in their rewriting of the biblical text as we have it, ascribe much too much to Moses. Institutions as well as ritualistic rules, undoubtedly belonging to later times, are declared to be Mosaic laws, with the clear intention of enhancing their authority. This is certainly a reason for suspicion, yet hardly enough for us to use, for the deeper motive of such an exaggeration is clear as daylight. The priests in the accounts they present desire to establish a continuity between their own times and the Mosaic period. They attempted to deny just that which we have recognized to be the most striking feature of Jewish religious history, namely that there was a gap between the Mosaic law-giving and the later Jewish religion, a gap filled in at first by the worship of Yahweh and only later slowly covered over. Their presentation denies this sequence of events with all the means in its power, although its historical correctness is beyond all doubt, since throughout the peculiar treatment the biblical text has undergone, there remain more than enough statements in proof of it. The priest's version had an aim similar to that of the tendency which made the new God, Yahweh, the God of the patriarchs. If we take into consideration this motive of the priestly code, it is hard not to believe that it was really Moses who gave his Jews the monotheistic idea. We should find it the easier to give assent to this since we are able to say from where the idea came to Moses, something which the Jewish priesthood had certainly forgotten. Here, someone might ask, what do we gain by deriving Jewish monotheism from the Egyptians? The problem has thus only been put back a step. We know no more about the genesis of the monotheistic idea. The answer is that it is not a question of gain, but of research, and perhaps we shall learn something by elucidating the real process. See you in the next episode.